Just a mousy nurse who keeps her eyes down. That's what Dr. Pierce said during shift report at 6:22 a.m., his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who'd never been corrected. He didn't know Ashley Cooper had heard him. She always heard everything. Her eye stayed on the patient census in front of her, ICU census at capacity, 3 post-operative bleeds, 1 septic shock from a contaminated line, but her jaw tightened. Barely. A tremor that lasted half a second. The kind only someone trained to recognize micro-expressions would catch. He had no idea who was sitting 3 feet away from him in the nursing station. Seattle General Hospital in San Antonio sprawls across 18 city blocks like a concrete prayer, its corridors humming with the steady wheeze of ventilators and the electronic beeping of monitors that never sleep. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead in their relentless rhythm, a sound Ashley had learned to tune out somewhere between Kandahar and her first night shift here. She moves through the ICU with a kind of invisible efficiency that makes people forget you existed the moment you leave the room. That's intentional. That's training. The antiseptic smell of bleach and saline drips fills the air, mixed with something underneath it, fear, maybe, or just the particular quiet of people fighting for their next breath. Ashley has smelled worse. She doesn't think about that anymore. It's 6:52 a.m. Her shift started 4 minutes ago, and she's already reviewed the charts on every patient in the West Wing. Muscle memory. Habit. The same methodical precision she used to apply to convoy routes through the Sanjin Valley now applies to 4 placements and fluid balances. The battlefield changed. The tactical awareness did not. She carries a cracked coffee mug with a faded Marines insignia, chipped on the left side from being dropped during a dust-off run out of FOB Shank 3 years ago. She lets her left hand wrap around it now, the tremor that lives there settling against the ceramic. Shrapnel damage. Nerve endings that still haven't decided whether they're dead or alive. The hospital assumes it's a stress response. Anxiety. She lets them assume. Her scrubs are navy blue, wrinkled at the knees from kneeling beside her patients. The name tag reads A. Cooper, RN. No rank. No call sign. Nothing to suggest that the quiet woman reviewing medication reconciliation reports for Room 407 spent 18 months as the most dangerous person in a phi-base perimeter. Room 407 holds a patient named Marcus Holloway, not her Marcus, but the coincidence of the name still hits differently at 3 a.m. This patient is a supply contractor with documented ties to Helmand Province procurement. His arrival at Seattle General 7 days ago triggered a red flag in a classified database that very few people can access. The flag reached an encrypted line. The encrypted line reached Ashley's mission handler. 18 months of surveillance. That's her assignment now. Not ranger missions or hostage extractions. Not field medicine under fire. Just 18 months of watching charts and following money trails that lead to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Dr. Richard Pierce, head of surgical services at Seattle General, has been inflating equipment orders and billing for procedures never performed. The surplus, hundreds of thousands of dollars, disappears into an account registered to a shell corporation in Grand Cayman. That same shell corporation has financial links to a compromised supply chain in Helmand Province. Military equipment diverted. Field supplies disappearing. Soldiers operating with incomplete kits. 2 soldiers died because a medical supply shipment never reached FOB Shank. Ashley knows this because she's the one who connected the dots. Dr. Pierce doesn't know any of this. Dr. Pierce notices her the way a person notices a piece of furniture, present, functional, unremarkable. He enters the nurse's station at 7:04 a.m. with his entourage of residents, his white coat pristine, his watch a Rolex that costs more than Ashley's monthly salary. His voice is loud in the quiet of the ICU morning. Residents part around him like water around a stone. Morning report, he announces, not asks. Conference room. 5 minutes. The residents scatter. Ashley closes her chart and stands, moving with the economical precision of someone whose body has learned that wasted motion gets you killed. She follows the group down the hallway, her shoes whispering against the tile floor. The fluorescent lights flicker, just once, but she catches it, a small electrical stutter in the hospital's nervous system. The conference room smells like cold coffee and printer toner. The residents arrange themselves in a semicircle while Dr. Pierce positions himself at the head of the table like a general surveying troops. Ashley takes a position at the back. Always the back. Always an exit route within 3 steps. ICU census at capacity, Dr. Pierce begins, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from never having been questioned. I want every non-critical patient transferred to the step-down unit by noon. I'm bringing in 3 new surgical cases today, all priority. I want 2 beds freed up by 10 a.m. He glances at the room. His gaze passes over Ashley without stopping. She watches his hands as he talks. Soft hands. No calluses. A man who's never held a scalpel doing trauma work, only elective procedures where the bleeding happens in predictable patterns and someone else manages the complications. Questions, he says. There are none. There are never questions. The residents have learned that questioning Dr. Pierce is a short route to poor evaluations and limited surgical exposure. As the group disperses, Ashley approaches her assigned patients. Room for 07 is first. The supply contractor lies in bed with his left leg elevated, a motorcycle accident, the chart says, though the entry wound patterns don't quite match a typical crash. She doesn't voice this. She just catalogues it. Everything gets catalogued. She checks his for line with the kind of focused attention that looks like routine nursing care. The angle of insertion. The depth. The tape placement. Her hands assess the line the way a soldier assesses a field position. What are the sight lines? What's the vulnerability? What happens if this fails under pressure? The line is secure. Properly placed. She notes the medication in a drip, saline with a steady infusion rate. Normal. She moves on to the next room. This is her cover. This is also her work. The 2 things have stopped being separate about 3 months ago. At 7:43 a.m., a man enters the ICU wearing a visitor's badge and the kind of posture that comes from 40 years of standing on a parade ground. He's visiting his brother in room for 12, a post-operative cardiac patient. But his eyes aren't on his brother. They're on Ashley. She doesn't notice him noticing. She notices everything. The man is grizzled in the way that only combat medics become, weathered, economical with expression, his movements suggesting a body that's been through every kind of suffering and decided to stop complaining about it. He watches her assess the 4 line in room for 11, the way she doesn't touch it unnecessarily, the way her fingers check the tension of the tape with clinical precision, the way she verifies the drip rate against the ordered infusion with the kind of focus usually reserved for high-consequence procedures. She finishes her assessment. Moves to the next bed. Her hand steady as a surgical laser. The grizzled man's eyes narrow. He's seen those hands before. Or hands like them. Or he's seen what they do, the quiet competence that comes from having worked trauma under fire, having held people together when the pieces were trying very hard to come apart. He studies her name tag as she passes. A. Cooper. Something shifts in his expression. Recognition, maybe. Or the beginning of it. The kind of half-formed memory that will haunt him until he places it. Ashley doesn't look at him. She's already moved on to room for 13. But her peripheral vision has catalogued him completely. Combat medic. Probably Kandahar era based on his age. Probably still carries nightmares about the ones he couldn't save. She knows the type. She knows the type because she's the type. At 8:15 a.m., her encrypted phone vibrates in her scrub pocket. One buzz. Not a message, a vibration pattern that only her handler uses. Check the secure server. New intelligence. She excuses herself from the floor, finds a supply closet, locks the door, and pulls up the classified server on a phone that has no business existing in a civilian hospital. The update is brief, typed in the specific language of intelligence briefings, target showing increased transaction volume. 3 deposits to Grand Cayman in past 72 hours. Possible timeline acceleration. Maintain surveillance. New development expected within 30 days. 30 days. She'd expected longer, but 18 months of watching someone's patterns teaches you to read the small shifts. Dr. Pierce is panicking about something. The money is moving faster. The theft is accelerating. She closes the secure server. Pockets the phone. Exits the supply closet and returns to the ICU like nothing happened. A mousy nurse who keeps her eyes down. A woman no one really sees. The fluorescent lights continue their relentless hum. Somewhere down the hallway, a monitor beeps. Somewhere in room 407, the supply contractor sleeps the medicated sleep of someone whose injury makes sense on paper but doesn't quite match the wound patterns. Somewhere in the San Antonio morning, a 4-star general who'll eventually recover in the VIP wing hasn't yet been brought to the hospital. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Dr. Pierce was about to notice her. Thursday morning came wrapped in fluorescent light and the antiseptic smell of a hospital holding its breath. Grand rounds at Seattle General always operated on ceremony, the kind where hierarchy mattered more than patients, where residents clustered like nervous students before a judge. Dr. Pierce moved through the ICU ward with the deliberate slowness of a man accustomed to being watched, his tailored lab coat pristine, his voice calibrated to carry exactly the right distance. Ashley stood against the back wall of the conference room, her chart tucked under one arm, her breathing the kind of controlled rhythm she'd learned in Kandahar when the waiting was worse than the fighting. She knew what was coming. Some part of her had always known. Dr. Pierce stopped at the workstation and pulled 3 patient files from the rack. His fingers, manicured, pale, soft, turned the pages with theatrical deliberation. "Let's talk about documentation," he announced, his eyes already scanning the room to measure which residents would perform the laugh he expected. Too many of our nursing staff believe charts are narrative assignments rather than clinical instruments. He opened Ashley's notes on Mr. Kellerman, the contractor with the suspicious equipment orders, the one whose chart had led her deeper into the fraud that Dr. Pierce had been meticulously building for 14 months. Patient presented with tachycardia and diaphoresis, he read aloud, his voice climbing into a register of performative disbelief. "What is this, a romance novel?" Perhaps Nurse Cooper thinks clinical notes should have dramatic flair. 23 residents, Ashley counted without moving her eyes, produced precisely the response he'd groomed them to give. A wave of laughter, synchronized, obedient. Someone snorted. "This," Dr. Pierce said, holding the chart above his head like Simba in the African sun, "is what inadequate documentation looks like." He let it hang there, let the silence congeal into something that felt like truth. Someone get Nurse Bedpan here a remedial writing course. More laughter, cresting higher. He turned the chart sideways, pretending to study her handwriting. The margins are cramped. The abbreviations inconsistent. And the clinical reasoning, he paused, shaking his head, well. Let's just say experience doesn't always translate to competence. Ashley's hands were steady. This was tactical information, she understood that much. He was establishing dominance, building a narrative in front of witnesses. He was creating the foundation for something larger. She filed each insult, each performative pause, the exact angle of his smile, all of it data. All of it leverage. One measured breath moved through her lungs. She didn't look away. She didn't look down. She let him see that the words were landing on something impenetrable, like shrapnel hitting Kevlar. That was when the tear came. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't vulnerability. It was a physiological response to sustained eye contact and controlled breathing, the kind of thing that happened in the human body when emotions were compressed into diamond-hard clarity. A single drop escaped her left eye, traced a path down her cheekbone, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking her gaze from Dr. Pierce's face. The silence in the conference room shifted. Residents exchanged glances. Someone's pen stopped clicking. Ashley's voice emerged steady as a surgical laser, each word precisely metered. "I've triaged mass casualties under mortar fire, Dr. Pierce." She paused, let the image settle. "Your insecurity doesn't even register as a tremor." The room went dead silent. Not the theatrical silence of before, something else entirely. Something heavier. Dr. Pierce's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His fingers curled around the chart. For exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The ventilator in the nearby ICU bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm into the void. Then Dr. Pierce recovered, but Ashley saw the moment the predator realized it had misjudged its prey. He turned to the residents with a forced laugh that emerged 2 octaves higher than his normal register. "Well," he said, gesturing dismissively at the chart, "that's the kind of defensive reaction that tells us all we need to know." But the authority was fractured now. The performance felt desperate, and everyone in the room could smell it. The grand rounds continued, but the architecture of the moment had shifted. Dr. Pierce selected different patient charts. His voice leveled out, became more careful. He didn't make eye contact with Ashley again during the round, and she filed that too, the way hunters flinch away from apex predators, the moment when a smaller animal realizes it's chosen the wrong target. Later, at 2:17 p.m., Ashley was standing in front of the vending machine on the 4th floor, feeding dollar bills into the slot with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere. The machine hummed its electric lullaby and whirred out a bottle of water. She was reaching down to retrieve it when Dr. Pierce rounded the corner with 2 attending physicians, deliberate witnesses. Ashley understood immediately, flanking his left side like remoras following a shark. "You know what your problem is, Cooper." His voice was different now, stripped of the theatrical performance but sharper in its directness. The presence of witnesses changed the calculus. He was asserting dominance again, but privately, with structure. "You think you're special. You think that one moment of sass in front of my residents means something." He stepped closer, his tailored lab coat moving like oil on water. "You're not special. You're a mediocre nurse who got lucky once." Ashley turned to face him. Her hands didn't shake. This was the truth he needed to believe, that she'd been rattled, that the tear had meant something other than what it did, that his words carried weight she actually felt. Let him think the armor had a dent. She should stick to bedpans and leave the thinking to people with actual medical degrees, he said, turning to his attending physicians as though they were a television audience. They offered him thin smiles. He leaned closer to Ashley, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something expensive and entirely synthetic, like a corporate fantasy of what power should smell like. "I'm this close to having security escort you out for workplace disruption." He held his thumb and index finger a millimeter apart. "One more incident. One. That's all it takes." Ashley lifted the water bottle from the machine and held it up to the light, studying the contents as though they might contain instructions from God. When she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only Dr. Pierce could hear it clearly. "I understand, Doctor." She let her eyes return to his, and she let him see something he desperately wanted to see, that he'd won. That she was beaten. That the hierarchy had been restored. He nodded, satisfied with this performance, and turned back toward the stairwell with his attending physicians. As they left, one of them laughed, a genuine sound, the laughter of a man who believed he'd witnessed an act of justice. Ashley waited until their footsteps disappeared down the hallway, then twisted the water cap open and drank. The bottle was lukewarm and plastic tasting, and it was the best water she'd tasted in weeks because of what she knew that Dr. Pierce didn't. His confidence was a mistake. His assumption that her composure meant compliance was a miscalculation that would eventually cost him everything. But that wasn't what occupied her mind as she walked back toward the ICU. That evening, she reviewed the latest lab work on the contractor, Mr. Kellerman, in room 403, the one with the suspicious equipment orders correlated to Dr. Pierce's billing submissions. She pulled up the equipment manifest from the surgical supply chain, cross-referenced it with the procedure logs, and there it was, a discrepancy of $47,000 in equipment costs billed for procedures that never occurred. The digital signature on the authorization was Dr. Pierce's. The money had moved to an offshore account registered to an entity with no public records. She'd been closing in on this for 18 months, patient by patient, procedure by procedure, watching the fraud accumulate like compound interest. Every chart she'd reviewed had tightened the noose. She'd gotten too close today. Dr. Pierce had felt the pressure. That's why he'd chosen her charts for the grand rounds. That's why the vending machine ambush had felt so deliberately structured. He was establishing liability, creating a paper trail that documented her as unstable, unreliable, a nurse prone to defensive outbursts and emotional responses. If something went wrong with her mission, he wanted witnesses who would testify to her instability. What he didn't know was that her encrypted phone would buzz exactly 12 minutes later with a message from her handler, "Maintain cover. You are 72 hours from final confirmation. Pierce is moving money again. $187,000 transferred at 14:23 today to the Helmand account. We have it on wire. Hold position." Ashley closed the file. She looked at the clock on the wall, 6:34 p.m. The Thursday shift change would begin in 13 minutes. The shift change clock read 6:24 p.m. when the first rupture sound tore through Seattle General's West Wing, not an alarm yet, just a hiss like something ancient waking up. The construction crew 3 floors below had driven their equipment into the main gas line during foundation work, and methane began flooding the ICU corridors like an invisible tide nobody could see coming. Ashley was restocking the medication cart outside room for 12 when the ventilator beside her wheezed wrong. The machine's pressure sensors had already detected it, oxygen saturation dropping fast on a post-surgical patient whose lungs couldn't compensate for the contaminated air mixing with his breathing circuit. The monitor beeped its mechanical warning. Once. Twice. Then continuous. The overhead intercom crackled to life, and a voice that had never wavered in 30 years of hospital operations broke slightly, code yellow, ICU wing. Hazmat contamination. Evacuate immediately. This is not a drill. Alarms erupted like gunfire. Every monitor on the ward began shrieking at once, a sound that bypassed the rational mind and traveled straight to the reptile brain that remembered predators. Staff scattered toward the exits. A resident abandoned a patient mid-vitals. A nurse grabbed her purse instead of her patient's chart. The charge nurse stood in the center of the corridor for 3 seconds, then ran, leaving the ICU doors swinging open behind her like a confession. Ashley did not move toward the exits. She moved toward the patients. Room for 12 first. The post-op cardiac patient whose oxygen sat was collapsing, BP 78/52 and falling. Pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing his lungs from the inside like a fist closing. The ventilator had created it trying to force oxygen through the contaminated atmosphere, every breath pushing more air into the space between his lung and his chest wall. Pressure mounting. Heart compressing. She already had the 14-gauge needle in her hand before conscious thought caught up with muscle memory. 18 months of pretending to be invisible, of pushing medication carts and nodding at physicians, and underneath it all the training that lived in her fingertips. She didn't ask permission. She didn't check a protocol. She found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, and her hands moved like they were remembering something her mouth could never admit, the same precision that had worked in a Phi Base 8 station in Helmand Province, same technique, different uniform. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was immediate, that particular sound of pressure releasing, the lung re-expanding as the trapped air vented. O2 sat began climbing. 68, 71. 79, the patient's eyes fluttered. His chest rose again. Color came back to his face like someone remembering how to live. Room for 13 was worse. The patient here was a 78-year-old trauma admission from overnight, ventilator dependent, and his monitor showed the same deadly pattern, pressure climbing, oxygen falling, the mechanical ding-ding-ding of a system in catastrophic failure. This one was stable enough 3 minutes ago. The contaminated air had destabilized him the same way it had the first patient. Same physics. Same deadly result if she didn't move now. She was already moving. The needle found its target in muscle memory's grip. Second intercostal space. The same practiced angle she'd learned in sandstorms and blood and the kind of darkness that had no bottom. The hiss again. Pressure releasing. Oxygen climbing. 62, 68. 74, his vital signs began their return from the edge. Room for 14 was the critical one. This patient had been sedated for a bronchial repair just 6 hours ago, still on heavy anesthesia, still completely dependent on the mechanical breaths the ventilator was forcing into contaminated air. When Ashley pushed into the room, the monitor showed what she'd been dreading: O2 sat at 54, dropping, and the pressure readings on the ventilator were climbing so high the machine was beginning to alarm in that particular pitch that meant code event. Seconds. She had seconds before the patient's heart began failing from the pressure crushing his mediastinum. She moved like someone who'd already died and come back. The kit was on the wall. Needle at ready. Her left hand found the anatomy, ribs, intercostal space, the thin margin between life and catastrophic failure. Her right hand moved with the kind of certainty that only comes from having done this when people were dying, when there was no hesitation budget, when the cost of a moment's doubt was someone's last breath. The needle. The hiss. The release. O2 sat climbed. 58, 64. 71, 78. 84. The patient's color changed from the purple-gray of hypoxia to something that resembled human life again. His heart rate, which had been climbing toward cardiac arrest, dropped back into the realm of survivable. The monitor's rhythm became something Ashley recognized, the kind of sinus rhythm that meant she'd bought him time. The fire department cleared the wing 90 seconds later, hazmat suits moving through the corridor with equipment that detected methane in parts per million. The contamination was real but contained. The rupture had been isolated at 6:51 p.m. before it could spread beyond the ICU. 16 people occupied the ward. 14 had evacuated. 2 had stayed, and those 2 had saved 3 patients' lives by refusing to abandon them when the protocol said to run. Ashley was checking the 3rd patient's pupils when the medic walked into the room. He was older, maybe early 60s, still wearing the shell of someone who'd spent decades carrying other people's emergencies. His eyes were the color of a storm that had seen too much ground combat, and when he looked at Ashley's hands that had just performed Kandahar technique needle decompressions with battlefield precision, something in his expression shifted like a locked door opening. "I was 68W, he said quietly. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd kept a secret for years and was about to break it open. Kandahar, 2012. You worked on my convoy after the IED strike on Route Silver. 3rd medevac of the day. You held the arterial bleed while we moved him. Your hands didn't shake." Ashley's entire body went still. Not from fear. From the specific cold clarity of a mission compromise she'd been trained to expect and had spent 18 months dreading. Her cover was a careful construction. Seattle General was supposed to be temporary, the surveillance was supposed to be invisible, and nobody from the combat zones was supposed to be in the hospital on a Thursday night, watching her hands work with the kind of precision that civilian nurses didn't possess. She looked at the medic with a face that had been trained to show nothing. "You're mistaken. I've never been overseas." But he was already nodding, and she could see the moment he chose, the instant where he decided whether to say another word or let her walk. His eyes traveled across her face like he was reading something written in scar tissue and controlled breathing. "No," he said finally. "I don't think I am." She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Long enough for him to understand that she'd heard him. Long enough for him to know that she was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with her hands or her precision or the way she moved through a crisis like water finding its shape. Then she turned back to the patient's chart and continued her work as if the conversation hadn't happened, as if her entire cover hadn't just fractured in the fluorescent light of a hospital room, as if nobody had just spoken a language that was supposed to stay buried. The patient's vital signs were stable. Oxygen sat holding at 86. Heart rate regular. Pupils equal and reactive. He would survive. And somewhere downstairs, Dr. Pierce was already reaching for his phone, already making the calls that would begin the machinery of her termination, already setting in motion the events that would lead to her becoming invisible in a different way, not a hidden operative anymore, but a fired nurse with a cardboard box of personal belongings and a decision to make about whether to blow her cover to contest it or let 18 months of intelligence gathering disappear into the silence she'd chosen. At the beginning. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that the combat medic knew. The worst part was that her hands had given her away. The worst part was the simple truth that sometimes the people you rescue remember you, and sometimes that remembering costs everything. The locker room smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Ashley sat on the bench, peeling off the contaminated scrubs that clung to her skin like a second layer of guilt. Her hands finally steady. Not shaking. Not trembling. Just steady, the way they'd been for the past 18 months while she'd learned to be invisible. 3 patients stabilized. Oxygen sat climbing back to normal range on all 3. The fire department had cleared the ICU wing at 11:23 p.m., pronounced the methane dispersed, confirmed no lasting structural damage. The medical part was over. The part where she knew what she was doing. Everything else was unraveling. She pulled on clean scrubs, watching her reflection in the metal locker door. The woman staring back looked like a nurse. Looked ordinary. Looked like someone who followed orders and filled charts and stayed in her lane. Not like someone who'd performed emergency needle decompressions using techniques learned in a phi base outside Sanjin Valley. Not like someone whose hands remembered how to work in darkness while mortars screamed overhead. Her badge sat on the shelf where she'd left it. Ashley Cooper, RN. Not captain. Not military. Not the person who'd stabilized a 4-star general under machine gun fire and watched him bleed out anyway, watched him survive. Just a nurse. The courier arrived at 11:16 p.m. She was already home, sitting on the edge of her bed in the studio apartment that cost $1,200 a month and held nothing personal except the folded flag on her nightstand. The knock came sharp and official. A man in a grey uniform, clipboard, requiring a signature she gave without reading the envelope. The letter was on hospital letterhead. Bold font. Formal spacing. Effective immediately. Reckless endangerment. Insubordination. Violation of direct evacuation orders during emergency protocols. The words assembled themselves into a sentence that said everything and proved nothing. No hearing mentioned. No appeal process. No notation that she'd saved 3 lives while Dr. Pierce watched from the safe zone. No mention of the state nursing board investigation already underway. Already launched. She knew how fast that happened. Dr. Pierce's phone call to the hospital board chairman, a golfing buddy who owed him favors, had probably been made within 20 minutes of the all-clear. By 11:48 p.m., the investigation was probably already being filed. By morning, her references would start getting calls. Casual ones. Just checking background. But coded. Wondering about any psychological concerns. Wondering if maybe Ashley had always been unstable. Wondering if maybe saving lives in an evacuation was a sign of something broken, not something brave. Her encrypted phone buzzed once at 11:59 p.m. The line crackled. No introduction. Just her mission handler's clip voice, the one she'd reported to every 3rd Thursday for 18 months. Stand down. Do not contest the termination. They're moving fast. Affirmative. If you challenge it, you're forced to explain your surveillance credentials. If you explain your credentials, you're explaining why a civilian nurse has a Pentagon security clearance. The contractor target knows hospital administration. We can't risk exposure. 18 months of intelligence gathering becomes operational compromise. Your call, but understand the cost. Ashley understood the cost. The cost was invisibility. The cost was walking away. The cost was 18 months of work, documenting fraudulent billing schemes, tracking embezzled medical equipment funds that had been routed to a weapons contractor with Helmand Province connections, all of it classified into silence. All of it unprovable. All of it worthless if she spoke. Copy, she said. When do you pull me? 48 hours. Safe house in Georgetown. New identity paperwork starts Monday. You're done at Seattle General. The line went dead. She sat in the darkness of her apartment and thought about being done. About invisibility as a permanent state. About the fact that in 48 hours, she would cease to exist as Ashley Cooper, cease to exist as a nurse, cease to exist as anyone would remember. The rain started at 1:15 a.m. Heavy. The kind of rain that comes without warning and doesn't apologize. She grabbed a cardboard box from the kitchen, the one the vacuum had come in, and started moving things. The cracked Marines mug she'd bought at a PX in Kandahar 6 years ago. A dying succulent she'd never remembered to water, its leaves paper-thin and resignation-colored. And the flag. Marcus's flag. Folded. Sharp creases that had never softened. She'd kept it wrapped in tissue paper in a showbox under the bed because looking at it while she was awake felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Marcus had been her combat medic during the Phi-Bay siege. 23 years old. From Reno. Had a little sister named Catherine who wanted to be a photographer. Had a laugh that sounded like helicopter rotors, high-pitched and mechanical and alive. The medevac bird had taken enemy fire on the extraction. Rocket-propelled grenade. Ashley had been in the jump seat, 30 seconds from home base, when Marcus's body absorbed the fragmentation that would have entered her chest cavity. She'd held his femoral artery closed for 2 minutes with her bare hand while the bird descended. 2 minutes of pressure while everything went red. 2 minutes of already knowing. The flag had come 3 weeks later. Standard issue funeral flag. White gloves included. A thank you letter from his sister Catherine that Ashley had memorized and refused to reread. Now she held it in both hands and sat at the bus stop on Esperanza Street at 1:38 a.m. in San Antonio in the rain that fell like judgment, and she put the flag in the cardboard box with the mug and the dying plant and everything else she hadn't managed to lose. Her phone buzzed again. Not the encrypted line. Regular phone. LinkedIn notifications. 5 of them in the past 2 hours. Dr. Pierce's network expanding. Looking for a reference on Ashley Cooper. Her nursing school. Previous employers. A hospital in Colorado where she'd worked for 8 months in 2019 before the Army had reassigned her. Her references would get confused calls. Casual inquiries. By morning, the damage would be 3-dimensional. Not just fired, but unemployable. Not just invisible, but erased. The bus came at 1:06 a.m. and splashed through a puddle that soaked the cardboard box. The flag darkened with water. She watched the bus brake lights disappear into the rain and didn't stand up to chase it. Just Saturday. Just held the box. Just thought about the 47 soldiers she'd kept alive during that Phi-Bay siege in Helmand Province when artillery support was 18 minutes out and the only thing standing between them and catastrophic casualty rates was her hands and her training and the absolute certainty that survival was not negotiable. 47 soldiers saved. 18 months of intelligence gathered. 3 patients stabilized during a gas leak evacuation. All of it classified. All of it invisible. All of it worth nothing in a world that didn't know it had happened. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was understanding that in 48 hours, even sitting at a bus stop with Marcus's flag, would become a security risk. Memory itself would become classified. She would have to forget Seattle General. Forget the patients. Forget Dr. Pierce. Forget that any of this had happened. She would become invisible in the way that mattered. Not invisible to enemies, but invisible to history. Invisible to the people she'd saved. Invisible to everyone except a Pentagon file marked secret no phone. Her phone buzzed at 1:51 a.m. Not the mission handler. Not her references. A text from an unknown number. Captain, routine hospital audit flagged your file. Security clearance anomaly reported. Pentagon notification in progress. Your location? The message came from someone with enough access to trace her encrypted phone. Someone in the chain of command. Someone who'd just found out that a covert military operative had been living as a hospital nurse in San Antonio and gotten fired for heroism. Ashley stared at the message for 3 seconds. Then she looked up from the bench and saw the black SUV turning slowly onto Esperanza Street, headlights deliberately off, moving through the rain like something with purpose. She didn't move. Didn't run. Didn't hide. Just held Marcus's flag in one hand and waited to see which side of the equation she was about to become. The SUV pulled to the curb. The rear window lowered. A woman's voice, calm and official, Captain Cooper. I'm Liaison Patterson. Pentagon wants you in Georgetown by dawn. We need to talk about what you found in Dr. Pierce's billing records, and we need to talk about your discharge papers. Things are about to get very visible. You need to be ready for that. Ashley got up, picked up the cardboard box, stepped toward the vehicle and finally understood what 18 months of invisibility had been building toward. The real work was about to start. 48 hours after the termination letter arrived, a routine hospital records audit flagged something that changed everything. Ashley's classified security clearance. Pentagon authorization required. The auditor's hands trembled as she escalated the discovery up the chain of command, each level moving faster than the last. By noon, the inquiry had reached the Pentagon. By 2 p.m., it had reached a 4-star general recovering in the VIP wing of Seattle General, a man whose name appeared in exactly 3 declassified operations and whose presence in a civilian hospital bed was itself classified. The general, 73 years old with the kind of stillness that came from having survived things that would break ordinary people, was reviewing discharge paperwork when the hospital administrator knocked. His security detail stepped back. The administrator entered with Dr. Pierce trailing behind, confidence radiating from Pierce like heat off summer asphalt. Pierce had prepared his case carefully. He'd made phone calls. He'd aligned allies. He'd positioned this as a routine professional matter, a nurse with a pattern of insubordination, documented concerns about her psychological stability, the gas leak incident as a final breach of protocol. The general listened without moving. His eyes, the color of worn steel, stayed fixed on the window overlooking the San Antonio skyline. When Pierce finished, the general turned slowly. His voice came out quiet, the kind of quiet that made grown men lean forward to hear it. Phantom, the general whispered. We called her Phantom because she could work trauma in absolute silence. No panic. No wasted movement. No ego. You worked Helmand Province. Pierce's face went pale. He'd made a calculation error. He'd assumed Ashley was no one important. A Marine colonel entered the room. He hadn't been there before, security detail dissolving to reveal military liaison. The colonel opened a leather folder. His voice carried the weight of official documentation, each word pressed flat and hard. Captain Ashley Cooper, for extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Helmand Province, performing 47 surgical interventions under sustained enemy fire, resulting in a 94% survival rate. The colonel's eyes lifted from the citation. She worked phi-base medicine with a ballpoint pen and a knife when supplies ran out. She kept soldiers alive in sandstorms while rounds impacted the tent. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. The wrong words tried to form. 47 interventions, the general repeated. His hand moved to his chest where scars lived under the hospital gown. One of those interventions had been him, a shrapnel wound that would have killed him in any other context. That nurse you terminated for reckless endangerment was the one who taught the entire 75th Ranger Regiment our current crisis protocols. The Pentagon liaison had already arrived. She'd coordinated with the hospital administration before the general even entered the building. Within minutes, the reinstatement was official. Ashley's termination was rescinded, her security clearance re-established, her back pay calculated. But something else was happening in parallel. Something Dr. Pierce couldn't stop. Pierce made his mistake at 4:48 p.m., sitting in his office with the door closed. He accessed the hospital records system, his credentials still valid, his database access untouched. He began modifying Ashley's personnel file. Changing dates. Softening language. Inserting fabricated concerns about her well-being, painting himself as the protective supervisor who'd tried to help her. Every keystroke was logged. Every modification timestamped. Every change tracked across the secure federal network because Ashley's file was now flagged as federal property under active investigation. The FBI Cybercrimes Unit traced his access within 90 minutes. What they found in his digital trail wasn't just the personnel file tampering. It was everything. The fraudulent billing scheme that Ashley's 18-month surveillance had been designed to document. Inflated equipment orders. Procedures coded as performed but never executed. Offshore account transfers matching the exact amount of the billing discrepancies. The contractor he'd been feeding supply chain intelligence to, the one with connections to weapons trafficking networks in Helmand Province. All of it connected. All of it documented. All of it digitally preserved as evidence. Federal agents arrived at Seattle General at 6:13 p.m. Dr. Pierce was in the doctor's lounge holding court with residents, still explaining how he'd handled the Cooper situation appropriately, how she'd forced his hand, how military pressure was unreasonable to expect compliance with. His voice had the brittle quality of a man who was still winning. He didn't see the two agents enter until they were standing in front of him. "Dr. Pierce, we need you to come with us." Not a question. Not a request. He stood, confident this was a formality, a misunderstanding that would be cleared up with one phone call to the board chairman. They walked him past the nurse's station, every head turned. Past the conference room where he'd conducted grand rounds. Past the same vending machine where he'd mocked her about bedpans, where he'd let his contempt spill out like poison. One agent produced handcuffs. "You're under arrest for healthcare fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of a federal investigation." The handcuffs clicked shut in front of the entire shift. The sound of them closing was like a period at the end of a sentence that had been written in real time. Pierce was still protesting as they walked him out into the cooling San Antonio evening, his voice rising, insisting he'd done nothing wrong, that this was all a misunderstanding, that he knew the board chairman, that he'd worked this hospital for 23 years, that someone had made a terrible mistake. A resident whispered to the attending physician, "That's the guy who called her nurse bedpan." Nobody corrected her. Nobody needed to. 3 months later, Ashley stood in her dress uniform at the Pentagon, every medal pressed flat against the fabric, every ribbon aligned with military precision. The tremor in her left hand that had started in Helmand Province and never fully departed had finally steadied. She'd learned to work around it, to compensate, to make it irrelevant. Now it was still. The general pinned a commendation to her chest in a ceremony attended by 200 people. Among them were the soldiers whose lives she'd saved, the ones who'd come back from Helmand, the ones who'd walked into trauma tents and found a nurse with Kandahar calm hands waiting to keep them alive. The combat medic from the hospital stood in dress blues now, his own uniform decorated with the medals of service. He saluted her, finally allowed to acknowledge what he'd recognized at the vending machine all those months ago. He didn't need to say anything. His eye said it, "I knew." The Pentagon liaison approached with a box made of mahogany wood. Inside, folded with the precision of military ritual, was Marcus's flag. Someone had retrieved it from the rain-soaked cardboard box she'd left at the bus stop. Someone had cleaned it. Someone had preserved it. With it came a citation in Marcus's name, finally processed after years of bureaucratic delay, finally approved, finally official. The sacrifice that had seemed invisible was now recognized. The general's voice was quiet, the way it had been in the hospital room when he'd explained who she was. "Your cover held for 18 months. The contractor is in custody. The supply chain corruption is dismantled. 17 people involved in weapons trafficking across medical supply networks are facing federal charges." "And Dr. Pierce?" He paused, letting the silence fill with everything that name had become. "Teaching CPR at a community college for minimum wage. Medical license suspended pending trial. Still insisting he did nothing wrong." Ashley held Marcus's flag to her chest. She thought about the bus stop. The rain hammering like applause on the pavement. The moment she'd thought invisibility was the permanent price of service. She thought about Dr. Pierce's contempt at the vending machine, his voice dripping with condescension, his absolute certainty that she was nothing. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. That was what the general said, his weathered hand touching her shoulder with the weight of command and the gentleness of someone who understood. Ashley nodded. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer phantom. She was Captain Ashley Cooper, and every scar, the trembling hand that had steadied, the folded flag that was finally honored, the 18 months of humiliation that had been the price of bringing criminals to justice, was exactly what she had been willing to pay. She saluted the flag one final time. The room went absolutely still. 200 military personnel saluted in response, a wave of recognition that said, "We see you. We always saw you." If you've ever been underestimated because of what you do or who people thought you were, I want to hear from you. Subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this in the comments. Captain Ashley Cooper's story isn't unique. There are invisible heroes in every hospital, every precinct, every workplace, people whose strength is so quiet that the world nearly missed it. What would you do if you had to choose between recognition and the mission? Drop a comment below.